Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for everyone who is attending our webinar to get to know who we are. So we are SPARC. We are the Statewide Pacific Islander Asian American Resource and Coordinating Center. So the team is on the call right now. Rod Liu is online. He's our Executive Director. I am Beatriz Aurelio. I'm the Program Manager. We also have Cassandra Park, or Cassie. She's the Program Associate, as well as Allison Barcelon, who's our Communications Associate. So just some housekeeping that I wanted to start with is the webinar will be recorded and sent to emails provided in the login that you use to sign into Zoom. All of you participants will be muted throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So I will turn this over to Rod to get started on our mission as well as the background of appeal.
Thank you, Bea. Just wanted to welcome everybody to the SPARC webinar. We're really excited about talking about the things that SPARC has been doing over the year and this opportunity to share with you some of those exciting events. In addition to being the Executive Director of Appeal, I am also the Project Director for SPARC, and I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit about who our organization is for those of you who are not familiar. Appeal, Asian Pacific Partners for Empowerment, Advocacy, and Leadership is a national health justice organization based in Oakland, and this is actually our 25th anniversary this year. We've been around 25 years doing work, particularly in Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, but we also partner with other communities of color and LGBTQ communities. What's going to be shared later on in the presentation is going to go into detail of what SPARC is about and what we've been doing. But I just wanted to share that all the work that we do through Appeal has an intentional framework that we use to help move our communities towards equity in tobacco control and equity in health. That focus or that framework includes the community readiness framework. It also includes a four-pronged policy change model and the community leadership development effort. All of these, or most of these, will be talked about later on in the webinar. But I think during the times where we are witnessing still tobacco use high among Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, with the rapid evolution of e-cigarette products and these very turbulent political and social times, I think it's important for us to be forward-thinking, to have an intentional framework in which to move our efforts toward equity, and to be bold in our efforts, trying things that perhaps haven't been done before. We're particularly excited about the SPARC project because it's a chance to replicate in California what we've been doing in other parts of the country. Want to particularly thank and acknowledge our funder, the California Tobacco Control Program, for this opportunity to serve our communities, but also for helping to prioritize really important components of this whole statewide coordinating center initiative, including the community leadership work. And Cassie is going to be talking about that in detail later. So for this webinar, we hope that you will learn about SPARC, but we also hope that there will be opportunities to collaborate with many of you in the work that you're doing as we work towards eliminating disparities in the Asian Pacific Islander community and working towards the end game where there is no tobacco use. So I'm going to turn it over to Bea to talk a little bit more about SPARC.
So we did have a map that we just had up, and that was kind of our appeal network. So if you want a copy of that, it'll be in the email that will be sent out to you. And it's just a map of all the different partners that Appeal has had throughout the United States. And it's mapped in different colors where the dark blue indicates more than 15 partners over the time. So you could see Appeal has been heavily involved in tobacco control efforts in California since 1994. So you could see there's a little star over California, and that represents kind of like our SPARC network. So I'm going to turn it over to Cassie right now to talk about some of the impact of tobacco in our communities.
All right. Hi, everybody. This is Cassie. I'm the Program Associate for SPARC. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data and the impact of tobacco and how it's more than about prevalence. So if we go to the next slide, we see here we have two infographics from the truthinitiative.org. On the left-hand side, we see this orange graphic that shows cigarette use in California. In 2016, there were 11% of adults that smoked, and in comparison to the national average of 17.1%. And then if you look below that, we have high school students in 2017 that the California average was 5.4% compared to 8.8% as the national average. And we are seeing a decline, or there is less of a prevalence in California, and there is a decline in traditional cigarette use. But if you look at the infographic next to that, which is other tobacco use among adults and high school students, adults were using e-cigarettes at 1.4%, followed by smokeless tobacco at 0.6%, and cigars at 1.7%. And then in 2017, we have high school students at 17.3% smoking e-cigarettes and smoking or using smokeless tobacco at 2.8%. And in comparison to the national average, the rates were 13.2% for e-cigarettes and 5.5% for smokeless tobacco. And then if we go to the next slide, we have tobacco facts by the California Department of Public Health that was released just recently. And you can see here there's the cigarette smoking rate among California adults. And while there are 6 eligible regions to receive funding in California, only 4 were funded to partner with SPARC, and that's the Bay Area, the Central Valley, the South Coast, and LA. And there were 2 that were not funded, and that includes Gold Country, which is Sacramento, up north, and then we have Tri-County South, or the Inland Empire, which is San Bernardino and the Riverside area. We'll touch more on the 4 regional partners later, but we did want to highlight some of the key areas that have high populations of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders, and the smoking rates compared to the statewide average. So the statewide average is 11.7%, and in comparison to the Los Angeles area that has a smoking rate of 11%, and Merced has a smoking rate of 14.7%. And then if we look at Sacramento, there's a rate of 13.6%, and then San Bernardino is at 14.4%. So these 2 cities are both higher than the state average, and these are also regions that were not funded, which is where we're trying to focus a lot of our outreach efforts on at the moment. And then if we go on to the next slide, we have another infographic released by the California Department of Public Health that shows that the statewide average, the statewide rate of tobacco use among California youth was 12.7%. But then you can see here they broke it down by gender, LGBTQ, race and ethnicity, and even grade level. For race and ethnicity, we can see Pacific Islanders at 17.1%, and then American Indians at following American Indians at 19.7%, and whites at 18.2%. And they also have Asians here at 7%, However, these numbers could be masking significant disparities within Asian American and even Pacific Islander populations, and even amongst these very aggregated populations as well. And then if we continue on to the next slide, we have a report that was released by Appeal in 2012, which shows that the disaggregated data shows that there are significant differences in tobacco use among Asian populations. If you can see here, the smoking prevalence for men, we have Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander with 36.3%, followed by the Vietnamese community at 30.7%. So even though we see here there's a large amount of Vietnamese men that are smoking at a higher prevalence rate, we wouldn't see that because they're lumped together in this Asian category here, which is 6.5%. And the same goes for the smoking prevalence for women. Again, we have Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders at 23%, and followed by Korean women at 20.5%. But then these are all lumped together in this single Asian or multiple Asian category at 8.8%. And then we'll go on to the next slide, and Bea will talk a little more about the industry.
So the SPARC program is one of the objectives and goals is to develop an enabling system to support Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander groups and tobacco control activities. So on the next slide, we have a few documents from the tobacco industry that kind of talks about targeting as well as the focus on the AANHPI population. And so this kind of highlights why it's important for us to do the work we're doing in our community and why we're focusing on this population. So here are some highlights. It says the tobacco industry highlighted that the AAPI market was important due to population growth and geographic clustering. AAPIs also have predispositions to smoking and increased consumer and purchasing power. And high percentages of AAPI retail business owners could be potentially an area where tobacco products could be sold. So targeting is one of the tactics that the industry is using for our population. So on the next slide, you could see that there are two photos here. The first photo is the 1999 Virginia Slims ad, and this is specifically geared towards Asian Americans. And then underneath it, it's some ads from 2019 of flavored tobacco. So you could see here that the tobacco industry is specifically targeting the populations we serve. This is advertising then and now. So 20 years later, the product may look different, but not much has changed. AANHPI communities are still being targeted through branding and flavors. So in the bottom picture, you could see there's ube, winter melon, lychee, and those are some of the flavors that some of our population groups are familiar with. So on the next slide, we kind of talk about tobacco control in California as a historical overview. As people may know, there is a long history of tobacco control work that has resulted in funding of ethnic networks and has resulted in our program specifically, which is SPARC. So on the next slide, we have our logo. This is SPARC. The SPARC program is funded through the California Tobacco Control Program Statewide Coordinating Center grant, and we aim to foster interactive and integrative collaboration and communication among regional projects and others in the state, working to reduce tobacco-related disparities among the diverse Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. This was made possible by the work that came before in California and nationally, and it moves beyond diversity to inclusivity and equality. Our support to API regional projects is our focus, but also other AANHPI and priority populations have coordinating centers just like us, like the LGBTQ+, African American, Latinx, and I think there's a rural one now. So beyond the goal of policy change, is what SPARC is focusing on and looking towards community change. So right now, SPARC is funded under the recent passing of Prop 56. And so we have a list of our advisory committee members on the next page, or next slide. They provide guidance and advice to SPARC activities. And some of the people on our advisory committee are one of our regional projects. So we have Waymakers, Bay Area Community Resources, Dignity Health, and Health Collaborative. So on the next slide, you can see the 4 regional projects that SPARC has. So like Cassie said earlier, we had 6 eligible regions that could have been funded, and 4 were funded right now. So that's API Chat, API Pact, Dignity Health, and Waymakers. So SPARC provides support. Our larger goal is supporting any tobacco control work with AANHPI in California. That's not limited to the 4 projects. So some of the recent activities that SPARC has participated in is our information and educational days. You can see here, here's our photos, both with our regional projects and others who wanted to join the API caucus. Recently, SPARC helped support the API caucus visits during information and educational days with the American Lung Association. The API caucus was made up of the different regions, and visits included Assemblymember McCarty, Senator Dr. Pan, Assemblymember Bonta, Senator Skinner, and the overall API caucus. The collaborated efforts were to raise awareness about the targeting of AANHPI's use and access, flavor specific to AANHPI, and data disaggregation. So on the next slide, we have our 4 program objectives within SPARC. So one is to develop an enabling system to support AANHPI tobacco control activities, and that includes our advisory committee. The second is to create educational materials on tobacco control and policy changes. Third is annual leadership summits that Cassie will go into a little bit more. And then the 4th is our strategic plan and our tobacco control policy platform that Rod will go over as well. So what does SPARC not do? SPARC does not provide direct services, cessation services. We don't provide direct services like medical services. We don't do translation services or provide technical assistance like the Loop and the other CTCP projects. We don't fund projects as well as conduct research or collect research. And we also don't implement local policy change or work on specific policies. So if we move on to the next slide, I was going to talk about a little bit about building a team and infrastructure to create support for others within the SPARC project. So one of the goals of SPARC, which is on the next slide, is to move towards liberation for our community. So this picture illustrates 4 scenarios that is being focused on today in health. Equality, as you all may know, everyone has the same access to services regardless of their ability to access such services. Equity is tools and resources that are given to communities or individuals who need additional assistance to reach their potential. However, the sad reality, like in this picture, is that access to good quality of life is dependent on what tools and resources you have at your disposal. Sometimes the less resources and tools, the worse one off can be. SPARC is working towards the future of the last photo, which is liberation. SPARC is determined to help provide the resources and tools to develop an infrastructure to support others. Currently, SPARC is creating educational toolkits, policy toolkits, and working with our regional projects to develop opportunities for our communities to advocate for liberation. And so I will pass this on to Rod so that he can kind of talk about our strategic plan as well as our tobacco control policies.
So I know that many of you are familiar with tobacco control policy change, but for the benefit of those who are new to this work, I wanted to give a little foundation on policy change and how the appeal and SPARC models connects what we've done in the past and what our vision for the future is. This is a diagram which shows the impact that policy change has had historically on annual cigarette consumption in the United States. So for those of you who've not seen this before, particularly on the decline from the 50s on, there are key events that have taken place that are each associated with a decline in cigarette consumption. Many of those are related to policy change. And so the great impact of focusing on policy change in tobacco control is actually seen as one of public health's top 10 successes in the 20th century. Appeal looks at policy change similarly, but we also try to broaden the definition of policy change to include not only legislative change, but also change on the community level, in mainstream institutions, and actually also on the corporate level. And I'll give you an example of each of those. This is another way of looking at that same four levels, where the foundation is really on community policy change. And while some in tobacco control may associate community policy change with voluntary policies, it is a really important entree for some community members to engage in policy change. And this can include things like tobacco pledges not to accept tobacco industry monies, to local community events which restrict any smoking or use of tobacco products, such as the Pacific Islander Festival in San Diego. The second level up is mainstream institution policy, which is also often known as some of our equity work, the ability to work in changing the system to make it more supportive of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities engaging in tobacco control and tobacco control policy. Legislative policy level, you all know, the top is really corporate policy, and an example for tobacco would include the 1988 Master Settlement Agreement. I think there's still a question 20 years later on whether that actually resulted in funds staying in tobacco control in each of the states. But that is one of the few examples where there was a partnership with the tobacco industry on a tobacco control policy. We also have developed a framework for how we get to policy change. And rather than using the typical logic models or diagrams we've created with our partners in one of our research projects, this river analogy, which really shows the journey that communities can take to eventually get across that bridge and into policy change. And many of the benchmarks that you see outlined in pink, which are the assessment phases, are a variety of different ways to collect information from communities to identify not only their readiness, but what the environment is for doing policy change. And then the green dots are representative of a very important phase, which is the capacity building stage. This includes our community leadership programs, which Cassie will talk about later. But this often is a step that is not included in some policy change work. And because our communities oftentimes are at an earlier readiness to do policy change, these steps become absolutely vital for us to engage our communities around. These are a few examples of different policies that have been worked on through that project. There's also examples of what's currently being done. In that research project, we worked with two communities, the Cambodian community in Long Beach, and they were really focused in on smoke-free skate parks, and the Pacific Islander community in San Diego, who were working primarily on tobacco-free pledges from Pacific Islander organizations, as well as working towards smoke-free multi-unit housing. There will obviously be an opportunity at some point in the future for you to hear more about what each of the regional projects are doing. Some of them are working on menthol bans, some of them are working on multi-unit housing, some are working on smoke-free campuses in city colleges. There's a lot of exciting policy projects that the regional projects are doing. In addition to that, there's been some great examples of working with city councils to create flavors, restrictions, or bans. There was an attempt in Livermore that's ongoing to get the city council to adopt a flavor ban, and that's still in work. But I think probably the most exciting example is of Sacramento City Council that actually passed that flavors restriction. And we could talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Cassie.
All right, thank you, Rod. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our leadership training and how we build capacity and professional development. So if we go on to the next slide, leadership is the ability to move individuals, communities, and systems towards positive social change. We like to use this statement, especially focus on the aspect of moving and towards positive social change as the foundation to build capacity and to form our leadership trainings. And then in the next slide, we have a few photos from our fellows and summits in the past. Since its inception in 1994, Appeal has trained over 1,400 fellows across the country. On the top photo, we have the LAMP Fellows. LAMP stands for Leadership and Advocacy Institute to Advance Minnesota's Parity for Priority Populations. You know how Appeal loves our acronyms, so we have the LAMP Fellows that helped influence passage of the Minnesota tobacco tax. And then we have beneath that photo, the Youth Advocates for Change Summit, which was this past fall in 2018. So in the next slide, why become an Appeal Fellow? So based on information from one of our fellows, Appeal trainings are intense, in-depth, refreshing, and understands and embraces the diversity and cultural perspectives of the participants. And most of all, you feel good, because for the first time, my history, cultural, and experiences were allowed at the table. So in the next slide, I'll talk a little more about the leadership program that's coming up. We will soon be launching our leadership summit in June, or this is June, June 20th to the 22nd in San Diego. Fellows will enroll in a 10-month program. So far, we have about 31 to 32 fellows that have been enrolled. In the program, they'll be participating in bi-monthly webinars. They'll also do gatherings with their coaches. Gatherings can be done in person or over the phone, or webinars such as this. There will also be community engagement through an advocacy piece that's also a part of the leadership program. And then it'll end with a capstone summit next spring. And last month in May, we had our SPARC coaches training in Emeryville. We had our 6 coaches come down to Emeryville from different regions of California. So if you see this photo here, we have Tana Lepule from the South region. He's from San Diego. And we have Sherry Calibo, who represents Sacramento and Gold Country. And then we have Bimi Nguyen from San Jose, who will represent the Bay Area. Sambo Sak, who will represent Long Beach in the South Coast region. Then Jake Brian Tanukai, who will represent LA County. And then there's Rod and me. And then Bao Lia Zhang, who represents the Central Valley. They'll be facilitating and assisting fellows throughout the duration of the program, and will also be helping facilitate sessions through in our leadership summit in a few weeks. They'll also be providing additional support to fellows, connecting them to resources and navigating through systems. And then some upcoming events we have, other than the SPARC Leadership Summit, we will be having a fellows orientation webinar. It'll just be for our leadership fellows. That'll be next week. And then we have the Tobacco Control University coming up, June 25th to the 26th, where we'll be tabling and presenting. And then we'll also be joining the National Conference on Tobacco or Health, along with our Aspire group from Appeal in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Then we have a health equity conference in November, and then some local in-district INE days coming up in the fall. And we'll also be having more webinars that we'll be posting on our website and our social media. And then now we'd like to take this opportunity to answer any of the questions that you may have. If there are any questions in the Q&A, Allison can share those with us. Just post them up right now and we'll get to those questions.
One question that I think we have is someone's asking, what other ways can someone get involved if they miss the application deadline for the SPARC Leadership Program?
Okay, so I can answer. Oh, go ahead, Bea.
Some ways that people can get involved if they miss the SPARC Leadership Program deadline is you can sign up to receive our newsletter to get some updates on what the fellows are currently working on. You can also check our website to follow some of the fellows projects. You could also volunteer with us at one of our local INE days. And then through our newsletter as well as our Facebook and website, you can find out when our next round of applications will be released for the next year for our leadership summit. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Kathy.
No, I think that's good.
Another question is the SPARC Leadership Program open for youth as well?
Okay, I'll get this question. So the SPARC Leadership Program is open to folks of all ages. So our fellows represent a very broad age range they have to be at least 18. So it goes from 18 to the mid-30s. We were hoping to folks a little older just so that we can bring different experiences and to the table, but at the moment we were recruiting folks from different age ranges.
So Bea, if anyone wants to volunteer with SPARC, who should they contact?
They can contact me. My email address is baurelio@appealforhealth.org. It's also on the bottom of the slide here. If any of you have any follow-up questions or if you want to volunteer. And our website is also on this slide. All right, so I think there's no further questions. Is that correct, Allison?
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who participated and got to know us a little bit more. Like Cassie mentioned earlier, you may be seeing us at different events coming up. So we are presenting at Tobacco Control University to talk about our program. We are also going to be attending the Health Equity Conference with CTCP, as well as the National Conference on Tobacco or Health will also be there. So if you do have any other questions or want to reach out to me individually, my contact's on here, and you will receive this presentation as well as the recording in your email. So I wanted to say thank you again for all of you who joined us, and we look forward to working with all of you in the future. Thank you.